Places like Dubai, Monaco, and the Cayman Islands are widely known as so-called tax havens, where you can go and pay zero tax without a lot of effort. But what you may not know is there are many lesser-known low-tax jurisdictions that you've never heard of. And today I'm going to share with you 4 that we don't talk about a lot. Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson. This is Nomad Capitalist, where we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best. And one way you do that is by reducing your taxes. You don't pay 25, 35, 45% on your business or on your personal income or on your capital gains. You find a way to reduce that so you can put that money back to work for you. And what we've talked about over the years is, zero tax countries are hardly the only place that you can go to reduce your tax burden. You've got territorial tax countries, you've got countries with tax exemptions, you've got countries with non-dom programs, you've got countries with all kinds of different programs that may have taxes and aren't often thought about as low tax jurisdictions, but are actually very welcoming to foreign investors and foreign entrepreneurs. Today we're going to share with you 4 of them that we really haven't talked about a lot before. The first one's a country that you hear about all the time in the news, but really don't think about as a tax saving jurisdiction, and that's Russia. Russia rolled out a program where you can pay a flat tax. It's about $66,000 a year, 5 million rubles. And that flat tax, assuming some certain conditions are met in terms of how you run the business, covers all of your foreign businesses. So you go and live in Russia. You can go and live in Moscow or St. Petersburg, and hopefully you speak some Russian, but you can go and enjoy very clean cities. You can go and enjoy, big city, Moscow, obviously one of the biggest cities in the world, well connected to pretty much everywhere. Great restaurants, great culture, great social scene, a lot of things. And you can even work towards Russian citizenship if you want that as kind of the ultimate backup plan. And in doing that, you spend your time in Russia, you pay this flat $66,000 a year. We've had a few people who've looked at this who didn't qualify. I think a lot of them are in crypto. So you can't necessarily put anything into a company. But if you're running businesses and they're overseas and you just want to go and live in Russia, then you can pay this flat tax. And so essentially, let's say you make $1 million a year. Your tax rate is about 6.5%. If you make $10 million a year, your tax rate's under 1%. And you know what? You still pay more money than most people do in taxes in Russia. And so it's a win-win-win. Russia offers something to people who like that. I think especially, if you're in the dating scene, potentially a place to go. I think that if you want a lot of culture, it's a place that people who look at Europe don't really think about because there's this sort of stigma. But yet, everyone I know who's gone there said, it's interesting, I'd like to go back. That was a pretty cool place to go. And you can do that on pretty tax-friendly terms, assuming that you make enough to cover that flat 66 grand. Another country that has a lump sum tax program and developed it over the last couple of years is Italy. Now, you think about Italy. I've said, for example, I don't really want to buy property in Italy. I think that on a property basis, the government could do potentially some nasty things to people who own second homes. They could raise property taxes as they did in Greece. But on the personal income tax side, Italy has a pretty generous 15-year program. You can just come and pay a lump sum every year. If it's just you, it's 100,000 euros. If it's you and a spouse, it's 125,000 euros. And the only caveat is you can't have been a taxpayer in Italy in recent years. And so you can basically come. Now, they have other tax incentives. If you don't make enough to where that makes sense, they have discounts, especially in the South. But the lump sum gives you a bit more flexibility, where unlike a country like Portugal, for example, where you're rather drastically limited in where your company can be, and if you've been offshore already, you may have to redo your entire corporate structure. Italy's a lot more flexible on where that company can be because you're living in Italy, you're paying the tax. Unlike some countries, you don't even have to live there all the time. Now, if you go and live somewhere else substantially all the time, they may tax you also. But if you're someone who travels around the world, Italy's not going to necessarily make you stay in Italy all the time. They just want you to pay the bill. They want you to pay the 100 or 125,000 euros, and then you're a taxpayer in Italy. And that can help you in a number of different ways if you're trying to do certain things with banking or investment in the European Union, for example. Having that Italian tax home could come in handy. And so again, if you make $1 million, let's assume the euro is $1.15. You've got a $115,000 tax bill if you're single, so about 11.5%. Not terrible. Theoretically, by the way, if you're paying some tax in a country like the U.S., potentially there could be some credits there. if you make $10 million a year, now you're down to, again, barely 1% in tax. And so if you like the idea of living in Milan, for example, or living in Rome, or living in Tuscany in a villa somewhere. I mean, there's so many different places in Italy that people are very romantic towards. And you could do that with a very low, potentially single-digit tax rate if you are the 7 or 8-figure entrepreneur. And so you've got, decent flexibility. You can work towards Italian citizenship in that case. It takes 10 years plus some processing time, and you need to speak some Italian. But if you want an EU passport, you can do that, because the challenge of many EU passports is that you actually have to put in the time and live there and pay very high taxes. But in this case, you are paying your taxes, you're just simply paying a flat rate. And unlike neighboring Switzerland, it's a bit easier, in my opinion, in terms of paperwork, in terms of keeping up with. And you pay them, and you're done. Another country in Europe that stands out to me, that is a country that I love, is Ireland. Ireland has some of the highest tax rates in the world, but if you are not from Ireland, if it's not your domicile, then you can benefit from some very interesting tax exemptions. So this is one that you probably want to have a bit more money for. But the basis of this is, what's the money that you're bringing in to live on? And there's a lot of complexity in this, depending on where the company is located. But like Italy, you have a decent amount of flexibility if the company is being run somewhere else. If you're working for your company, you may need to be paying yourself a salary if they're rather drastic tax rates. But if, let's say, you've got a company that makes $10 million a year, maybe you pay some personal income tax, you live on that in Ireland, you bring in a little bit more money to live, maybe you can live there for 100,000 euros a year, something similar to what happens in Italy. And so again, your tax rate could be in the single digits. You are, again, contributing more than the vast majority of people are contributing in Ireland or in Italy. And so in a sense, you can, if that's your concern, you can say, hey, listen, I am paying my fair share in this country. And they're getting someone to come in and pay money they wouldn't otherwise have. And so there's a number of interesting things about how Ireland's program works. There's not a lot of people doing it. Potentially there are ways that you could pretty much pay zero for a while. But I think that for most people you're going to pay something, but if you are a 7 or 8-figure entrepreneur, it'll be very worthwhile. Again, you can work towards Irish citizenship. You're going to have to spend a lot of time there, quite frankly. It's not nearly as easy as Italian or Portugal through the Golden Visa. So if you really like staying there, and it's a beautiful country, beautiful people, English speaking, which I think for some people is very interesting, 4 seasons of sorts, which for some people is very interesting. And you can basically go and create an entire plan of how much money you're going to bring in, where the money's being earned. So it's hard to kind of go through the whole details here. But potentially you could pay a healthy amount of tax, but at a relatively low rate if your business is pretty successful. The thing that's probably more challenging in a country like Ireland is crypto. But if you run a business, more manageable. The last country is Uruguay, and I really... we've talked about Uruguay. I've been to Uruguay. Uruguay is certainly a little on the sleepy side. But what I love about Uruguay is they came out at some point during the pandemic about a year ago and said, listen, we're not going to raise taxes. I mean, how many countries do that? I think Malaysia came out at some point and said we're not going to have a wealth tax, although they did change their tax code a little bit. Didn't affect Nomad capitalists too much. But anyway, in the case of Uruguay, you can get a 10-year exemption. You need to buy property. It's going to cost you close to $400,000. And there's no income tax, no property tax, 10 years. I mean, it's basically a pretty clean slate. And you can live there for 6 months. And that could be your tax home, but you won't actually have the tax obligation. And so if you're looking for a place that has, first of all, that's far away from it all. I mean, just getting there from Colombia is a bit of a palaver. I mean, it was basically like flying from New York to San Francisco, or maybe Miami to Seattle if you're from the United States. It's more than flying across Europe. I mean, it's a palaver just within South America to get there. And so if you like that idea of being isolated, add that to not having to pay tax. I do think that, while Uruguay has been somewhat stingy in issuing citizenship, that's my personal opinion based on stories that I've seen, if you are actually living there and if you speak the language and if you adapt and if you become one with Uruguay, I do think you've got a chance at getting a very interesting uncorrelated citizenship where they're not part of the EU, they're not part of any of these groups, but you do have access to all of South America then. You've got one of the best passports at that point. And you could get that in as little as 3 years, plus processing time, all by buying a property that you need to live in anyway, and basically pay no tax. But what I like about them is the government basically come out and said, listen, we're going to bring in a couple 100,000 people. Obviously, their main target is people from Argentina, those people who bring their capital. And then the government said, and hopefully they'll bring themselves sometimes too. They were really aggressive in saying, we want to bring people in. We want to bring in money to our country. It's kind of this very interesting, flat country where everyone's just kind of living along the water, whether it's in Montevideo or Punta del Este or areas around that. So if you want something that's slower paced, it is not going to be like living in Milan. It's not going to be like living in Dublin, which is one of my favorite cities. It's going to be definitely slower paced, and you probably want to live on the coast somewhere and buy a house for this, $400,000-ish number. But you get a 10-year exemption. And so those are countries where the headline tax rate is not zero. Russia certainly has had relatively low taxes. Italy has not. Ireland does on the corporate side, and I think they've got a great policy, but certainly on the personal side it's very high. Uruguay has moderate taxes, but for you coming in, you can, for 10 years, for 15 years, or potentially forever, you can benefit from, hey, here's a certain amount of money, I'm not paying zero, I'm paying something, but now I can say I paid something, and I can use that in my international business. And perhaps for some people, it's important to know that they paid something for themselves or for their business interests. And you probably wouldn't have thought about those countries because they're not zero tax, but you can live there very affordably. Don't stop now. We've got well over 1,000 more videos here on YouTube for you to watch and learn how to go where you're treated best. And if you want to work with Nomad Capitalists personally, go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply, learn about our unique, tried and true process, garnered over years of experience, and learn how you can become our client.